do it. So this last Shabbat has been very trying for everyone on many scales, on many different senses. And the whole matter of Pikuach Nefesh on Shabbat definitely became something very, very relevant, very, very fast, very suddenly, very fast. We went from Stam, enjoying our Fatikin, and moved into the world of Pikuach Nefesh on Shabbat. And the question is what you can and can't do, and what the gvulot are. What makes this sugya very difficult is that the broad lines of saying Pikuach Nefesh Doche Shabbat, all right, fine, but the more we start going to the details of what about, like, how far do we go in terms of Pikuach Nefesh? These are questions that were very relevant a couple of years ago in the Corona, and are in a way more pressing when suddenly something like this happens on Shabbat, and war breaks out and no one knows what's going on, and people are complaining that Shabbos Yantiv, we can't find out what's going on. I said, don't worry, I don't think anyone has any idea what's going on. I think everyone's confused. I can't imagine the Prime Minister or the Matkal, Chief of Staff, had any idea what's going on. Had some kind of inkling, just like we all had, but what was actually going on. It's very relevant to the actual what we will matir to do. For example, as long as at the first moment when I thought, before our guy from Akitat Kolinut came in the spirit in Meir, what's actually going on, I thought there's just a missile or something. So they're shooting some rockets, and total, it's just evil and everything, but we can cope with that quite easily. It doesn't really, how much is justifying now sending everyone in, having every person have his phone on him, once you start realizing we're talking about something much more widespread, you realize, so you have to actually know the reality. And that comes up in many of the halachot, understanding what we're talking about before we start psikat halacha, before we say where we draw the line on different things. First of all, like what is the actual situation on the ground? What is the actual situation? So those are very, very basic things. But as we always do, we're going to try to see the Mekorot, try to go into them and see the analysis, how the analysis affects the actual way to think about the halachot. It's not just say, the halach is Shabbat, fine. I could just move on from there. I think if you go into the details of the Mekorot to understand how it works, how the whole system works, you get more precise, I wouldn't say psak as much as a more precise way of thinking about it, of understanding what we're doing here when we're Mechalel Shabbat for Pikuach Nefesh. There could be halachic ramifications, but I see that as secondary, right? The first step is to say this is what we're doing here, and then you say, if that's what you're doing here, mimele, the next step will be also the minute halachic ramifications. Often understanding what we're doing is more significant, even if the action is identical, but we understand what we're looking at, what the system is, even before the halachic ramification just makes some seder in our head, in our minds. So let's start from the Gemara in Yom Adaf Pehem Udbed that asks a very interesting question. Now, there are two interesting aspects to this question. Number one, the Gemara does not ask, does Pikuach Nefesh Doche Shabbat? The Gemara asks, how do we know Pikuach Nefesh Doche Shabbat? Which means that clearly Pikuach Nefesh is Doche Shabbat. That was not a question. That we knew. Now, you may argue that they knew because l'chora they had this every week, right? This wasn't the first time that anyone decided to Mechal Shabbat for Pikuach Nefesh, that specific situation. Although there is certain documentation that in the Maccabim time, in the Greek period, there is some documentation that Jews did not Mechal Shabbat despite Pikuach Nefesh. It's quite a wild thing. There's documentation like that, which raises interesting questions about the development of halacha, development of Bichlal. Different things, but we find that jarring, right? We can't imagine that we not Mechal Shabbat because of Pikuach Nefesh. But there's documentation that in the Chashmonim, the Chora, this was a Hasmonian halacha. That only then they realized, voila, if we keep on keeping Shabbat despite the Pikuach Nefesh, there won't be Jews. That it can't be. And then they stop and say, okay, wait, so clearly you have to Mechal Shabbat, but we need a source. We need to ground that in something. Now, the other interesting aspect is the Dochet Shabbat is a very interesting question, right? Because what about Kilayim? Is Pikuach Nefesh Dochet Kilayim? What about eating treif? What about, right? There are many other things Pikuach Nefesh is Dochet, but the Gemara specifically asks about Pikuach Nefesh Dochet Shabbat. Yeah, as always, we can look at this question in three ways, right? We can say that Shabbat is just a mere example. Really, Pikuach Nefesh Docheni mitzvah, apart from the big three, but apart from that, Pikuach Nefesh Docheni is Docheni mitzvah. And Shabbat is just a common example because Shabbat happens, I don't know, every week or so. Every week or so we have to, but it's more than that. Shabbat, every week, almost there's no Shabbat that there isn't the question of Pikuach Nefesh that comes up, as opposed to other things, right? When's the last time someone had to wear kilayim for Pikuach Nefesh? When's the last time someone had to, right? It's hard to think of examples. To eat treif, you can think of the examples, and there are examples, but the examples now, that there have been examples now of soldiers who didn't eat for 24 hours, and finally they get some food that was sent from somewhere, and they don't know what it is. They don't know if it's treif. So they too are told you have to keep your zay, you have to trust that it's kosher enough, and if it's not, so but that's a very extreme situation. That's not a normal case. As opposed to Pikuach Nefesh on Shabbat happens every week, on every army base, everywhere. Someone's Mechal Shabbat every week. So it could be. So that's what I'm saying. Shabbat could just be a very relevant, a very common example. And therefore, we ask Shabbat, it could also be any other mitzvah. And as always, there are two other ways of looking at it, right? Shabbat is more, Shabbat is less, right? You could argue that Pikuach Nefesh, it's easier to do Shabbat than do other mitzvot, or you can argue that Pikuach Nefesh is harder to do Shabbat than do other mitzvot. Harder is easier to explain, because Shabbat, you have many things that make Shabbat unique, make Shabbat more special, make Shabbat one of the central tenets of Torah. So Shabbat is easier to explain why Idafka wouldn't do Shabbat. So again, Shabbat, three options. Why we ask about Shabbat? One option is Shabbat is less. I didn't give an explanation to that yet. Let's start off. Shabbat is more. Shabbat is ot brit bini, right? Ot brit, and despite being an ot brit, it's still doche. Pikuach Nefesh is still doche Shabbat. Surprising, and that's why the Gemara focuses dafka on Shabbat. Second option is Shabbat is just another example, just a common one. That's why it uses that. And third option, that when it comes to Shabbat, there's a special d'chiyah that is not in other mitzvot. We're going to have to explain what that d'chiyah is later on in the page, if I could convince you guys. Rabbi Yonatan ben Yosef Omer, ki kodesh hi lachem. Shabbat is kodesh lachem. Hi mesura be'edchem ve'lo atem mesurim biyada. So Shabbat has to fit into our life. And if it negates our life, it means we're doing Shabbat wrong. Okay? That's Rabbi Yonatan ben Yosef. Rabbi Shimon ben Nasi Omer, v'shamiru b'nei Yisrael et Shabbat, umrat Torah chalal Shabbat achat kedei shishmor Shabbatot harbeh. So just I'll give another example to explain the kind of limud that we have here. There's a big argument, a big machloket about what happens if a person knows that they need to have an intake. A person donated the kidney. Did we talk about this before Yom Kippur? I don't remember. A person donated a kidney and will have to have an intake of 3 liters over Yom Kippur, over the day. That's doctor's orders. 3 liters over the day have to be drunk by 6 in the evening. There has to be that intake because otherwise it's really dangerous because the body needs to get used to the situation. Fine. Now, what is better? Is it better to wait and not drink at all until you must? Or do we say drink pachot mika shiur from dawn until dusk and you'll be okay? The intake technically will be sufficient. It's kind of torturous. Fine, but That way you're not over in the Isur Karet. Or do you say, look, right now I don't have to drink, so push it off. Wait, why should you drink when you don't have to? 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you have to have a 2-liter intake. All right, so I'll drink at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Why should I do all these other sins until that time? So that's the machloket. And the Ravaz brings a very interesting limud and raya, and he says, me'erev ad erev, v'yintem nashotachem b'tisha b'chodesh be'erev me'erev ad erev. So he says me'erev ad erev is 1 unit. So if I know that I'm going to, my question was assuming that at any point that I don't have to sin, I don't sin. When I have to, I do. But until then, I don't have to. So I don't. So I refrain. I wait until I must. Fair enough. Makes sense. Now, that's assuming that there's a timeline. This is my unit of Yom Kippur. Starts here, ends there. Right? And then I say, do I have to drink now? No. Yes. Now I must drink. So I pushed off sinning all this time. And finally, I must drink now, beseder. What's the justification of drinking at this point when I could wait and drink only at that point? But the Ravaz says you're looking at it wrong. Me'erev ad erev means this is 1 unit. So if you're going to have to drink here, you have to think about that here already. You're not waiting. It's wrong to wait until you must sin there because the question isn't at every minute. The question is me'erev ad erev. What happened within this unit? So within this unit, it's better to have many lavim and not 1 karet. Because it's 1 unit. So, is that point clear? In terms of Yom Kippur? It's not muskam on everyone, but it's an interesting limud. Why am I bringing that example? Because I think V'shamu b'nei Yisrael et Shabbat, the Torah is talking in some kind of a general present progressive. There's an ongoing Shmirat Shabbat. We're not looking at the current minute. Should I mechal Shabbat this minute or not? I have to look at the sum of Shabbatot, right? V'shamu b'nei Yisrael Shabbat, la'asot Shabbat l'dorotam brit olam. If you read the whole pasuk, v'shamu b'nei Yisrael Shabbat, la'asot Shabbat l'dorotam brit olam. So you have to think of the brit olam. You have to think of all the Shabbatot that Am Yisrael have in all of its, in the whole history and future of Am Yisrael, and think what is the most effective way to shomer Shabbat. How do I achieve the highest Shmirat Shabbat, the most Shmirat Shabbat? So, if I have someone who's in Pikuach Nefesh, if I don't break Shabbat, they'll die. But now I'll Shomer Shabbat. If I do break Shabbat, he's going to keep another 250 Shabbatot. So it's better to think about the 250 Shabbatot than to think of the 1. If I'm talking about the Klal, if I think about the time of the Cheshmonim, that many people were killed because they were keeping Shabbat despite being Pikuach Nefesh, how many Shabbatot did they not keep because they stuck to that Shabbat? Had they fought back on Shabbat, it could be that many of those people would have remained alive and would have kept Shabbat. So too, when I keep our country safe, having Medinat Israel allows many people keep Shabbat. And if I allow Medinat Israel to get destroyed, so many people won't be able to keep Shabbat. So I have to think of Shabbat as a more general concept. Now, what's interesting about both of these limudim, what do both these limudim have in common, Yaakov?
For one thing, they focus on Shabbat as being special.
See, I knew you were going to say that. I know you well enough. Was that you want to say another thing?
No, that's
okay.
That's
right, both of these are Shabbat specific. It's Shabbat specific limudim, right? It's Shabbat specific limudim. As opposed to Amar Vida Amar Shmuel, a general statement about all mitzvot, about Torah in general. Torah is there to keep you alive. Now, alive in the fullest spiritual sense. Your life is meaningless if you're not keeping Torah. But if you die, you're not keeping Torah either. And if Torah causes you to die, so you're doing Torah wrong. So that's a general statement about all of them. Now, so there is a difference between Rabbi Yonatan ben Yosef, who says Ki Kodesh Yilachem, and saying specifically Shabbat is not supposed to override your life, as opposed to Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya, what is more, let's say the nafkamina like this. According to Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya, let's start off. According to Rabbi Yonatan ben Yosef, what is holier, Shabbat or your life?
Your life.
Your life. According to Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya, which is holier, Shabbat or your life?
Shabbat might be, just you need to think big picture.
Right. Shabbat is holier. It just the question is not, it's not a matter of keeping you alive. It's a matter of keeping a person who keeps Shabbat alive. But we don't care about your life. We care about your keeping more Shabbatot. Mitzad atzmo, we could have thought that Shabbat would be that maybe Pikuach Nefesh isn't Docha Shabbat. Elamai, we say, yeah, but you have to look at the bigger picture, as Yaakov said. Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel says there's a broader concept in all of Torah. If Torah causes you death, you're doing it wrong. So I see this is a broader concept, right? Just as a general statement about all these things, I want to bring this Yerushalmi before we go deeper into the details. The Yerushalmi says, Tani hazariz meshubach, hanishal meguneh, v'ashoel erez shofech damim. So whoever rushes to just do it, not asking any questions, just do it. He's meshubach. If you're the Rav of the community and people are coming to your door on the day where war started, and they start asking you nitty gritty of minutiae of Hilchot Shabbat, of Pikuach Nefesh, so you're doing your job wrong. Right? That's meguneh. And the person who stops from going to save everyone, busy asking questions, shofech damim, in other words, I think what the Yerushalmi means is you have to consider when you want to go ask the Rav before you run off to the thing, you have to consider, am I saving more? Am I keeping the Shabbat more but saving fewer lives now? Because that's how you should be thinking. That should be the way you think about it, the way you look at it.